Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're watching or when you're watching this. My name is Gary Kruse, and I'm the Managing Director of Research for Arbo. For those of you who are not familiar with Arbo, we provide software, analytics, and services to the energy industry for decision analysis and business automation. Our software platforms structure millions of regulatory filings to provide our customers with data and analysis regarding the business risks and opportunities presented by legal and regulatory events and filings. We'd like to thank Gulf Energy for inviting us to speak to you today. For the next 20 minutes or so, we will be discussing the hurdles of hydrogen on the path to net zero here in the U.S. Given our time slot, we expect most of you watching this when it is first aired will not be from the U.S. Therefore, to the extent we can, we will provide some context for our point of view for those who don't live here. We should note that we are recording this on August 18th, and you won't be watching it until September 9th. Some of what we will be discussing is still evolving, and we could address that if you would like in the live Q&A following the presentation. We are sure many of the other presentations that have been made over the last 2 days explain the huge benefits that hydrogen offers on any path to net zero. Coming on the last day of this event, our presentation runs the risk of being the proverbial skunk at the garden party. That sort of ruins the whole event. However, as we will discuss in more detail, the U.S. is also running that risk as the environmental purists are already lining up to oppose the deployment of hydrogen as part of any path to net zero. But hopefully, at the end of our presentation, instead of being considered a skunk, you will view our presentation as more of a call to action, like Paul Revere riding through New England shouting, "The British are coming." But in this case, we are warning that the purists are coming. Here in the U.S., hydrogen is being met with serious resistance by what I will refer to as the environmental purists, who are pushing an agenda that is intent on blocking any path to net zero that relies on anything other than solar, wind, and batteries. As reflected in this quote from Sierra Club, a major environmental NGO, the purists are opposing hydrogen primarily because they think hydrogen is being used as a Trojan horse for the natural gas industry, and they want to keep all natural gas in the ground. The Natural Resources Defense Council, another major environmental group, has a bit more flexibility, but would only accept hydrogen development as the final piece of the puzzle, and certainly not as a blending agent with natural gas, nor as a solution to the intermittency of renewables. Even incumbent energy companies are skeptical that hydrogen will ever be economically viable, as reflected in this quote from the Chief Commercial Officer of Energy Transfer, one of the largest energy pipeline companies in the country. Finally, just days before we recorded this, a new paper was released here in the United States. It purports to show that blue hydrogen is worse from a greenhouse gas perspective than just burning the natural gas as a fuel source. Clearly, this study, if it even deserves that much respect, is designed to provide scientific cover for the hydrogen opposition groups. To highlight how the U.S. may be different from much of the rest of the world, it is helpful to have an understanding of the positions taken elsewhere. And for that, we will look at 3 recent reports or studies before turning to the most comprehensive one to date here in the U.S. As you will see, it appears that the U.S. is certainly not leading the adoption of hydrogen as a solution, and the hydrogen industry here may be at risk of being completely bypassed as a solution due to the advocacy of the environmental purist. Each of these reports is worthy of an entire seminar, and we will just be touching on some highlights from them to show how a similar approach might work here in the U.S. The first report we will touch on is one released this May by the International Energy Agency, or IEA. The IEA report gets top grades for honesty, but a failing grade for persuasiveness. As bluntly stated in the report, there is a huge gap between the rhetoric of countries that have pledged to reach net zero emissions by mid-century and the actions those countries must take between now and then to do that. But the report fails on persuasiveness because it lays out a single path that it claims is the most technically feasible, cost-effective, and socially acceptable. However, like a math student on a test who simply provides an answer but fails to show how that answer was derived, the report does nothing to rebut the wilder, less feasible, less cost-effective, or socially unacceptable plans that others are promoting. As for hydrogen, as seen here, the IEA's report is fairly bullish. It not only shows a substantial growth in the demand for hydrogen, but shows it being used for many purposes far beyond those that environmental purists would like, including as a blending agent for existing natural gas systems, use in commercial buildings, and as an energy for generating electricity as an offset to the intermittency of wind and solar. The next report is one that was published earlier this year by First Gas, which owns and operates the entire gas transmission system on the North Island of New Zealand. The report gets top grades for thoroughness and perhaps therefore for the ability to be implemented. On this slide, we show just one of the Gantt charts from the report. Some of the key tasks to note are public acceptance, regulatory change, and commercial arrangements. You'll note that all three of those indicate each is a multi-year program, but all of them must commence this year, or as they put it in New Zealand, straight away. We agree with that. And as we will discuss later, those are the same three primary hurdles that we see for the adoption of hydrogen here in the U.S. Our third report comes from Europe and is put together by a coalition of 23 gas infrastructure companies from 21 countries. It was issued in April of this year and presents hydrogen infrastructure plan for 2030, 2035, and 2040, with a dedicated hydrogen pipeline transport network, largely based on repurposed existing gas infrastructure. It is not nearly as thorough as the New Zealand report, so it gets only middling grades for thoroughness, but high marks for coordination and for getting out in front of an issue. As shown on the maps, the report provides a timeline and plan for converting the natural gas infrastructure in Europe into a hydrogen backbone that will allow the development of hydrogen and its distribution throughout the European continent. One of the key benefits of the plan is the repurposing of the existing natural gas infrastructure for hydrogen-only use. As this chart shows, the savings of this conversion is expected to be anywhere from 70 to 90% when compared to building an entirely new pipeline. We will discuss some of the hurdles presented by such a repurposing of pipeline here in the U.S., but we would expect similar cost savings. I am sure a number of other speakers have spoken about the technical and safety issues about such a conversion, but there are also regulatory and legal hurdles as well. We wanted to review these other reports before turning to the situation in the U.S. because they provide a nice contrast to what the industry faces here. The most significant study to date in our mind that addresses the energy evolution in the U.S. is a report that was released late last year and was prepared by Princeton University. The report has garnered some accolades for its rigorousness and is called Princeton University's Net Zero America. The subtitle is Potential Paths, Infrastructure, and Impacts. It sets forth 5 paths that it asserts are all potentially achievable here in the U.S. While the paths may be technically feasible, we think the report could have benefited by involving the political science department at Princeton, because all 5 paths do not appear to be achievable politically here in the U.S. It is in rebutting plans like these where the IEA's failure to show its work is a major problem. All 5 paths rely on a deep electrification of the economy, which we don't think will ever gain sufficient public or political support here in the U.S. A better subtitle for the report might have been 5 Paths to Failure. As shown in the chart, the use of hydrogen in all of the paths is fairly minimal. According to the report, the use of natural gas for space and water heating and cooking in residential buildings is nearly fully replaced by electricity, and the same is true for commercial buildings. Similarly, the use in the transport sector is minimal, because a foundational premise of the report is that fueling vehicles with hydrogen or liquids made from electricity requires much more electricity than using it directly in EVs. The political risks of the paths identified is severely understated in the report. The report asserts that the land use needed for the wind and solar projects it proposes would require an area the equivalent of the states of Arkansas, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Virginia, but then characterizes that usage as small. It doesn't even include the vast corridors needed for high voltage lines to bring that power to the demand centers. The report does provide a laundry list of 9 potential bottlenecks to achieving that goal, but in what it could be considered the understatement of all time, the very last bottleneck listed is community opposition to visual and land use impacts from wind, solar, and transmission. We believe it is exactly such anticipated opposition that led the IEA to reject such deep electrification paths. But since they didn't show their work, we will never know. However, the Princeton study does provide a map of the actual areas where the solar, wind, and transmission lines that could most effectively meet the goal would go, as shown on this slide. To limit the land use to the small amount it suggests, almost all of the land taken for this use will be in the Midwest. That land is not being taken to provide energy to those living in the middle of the country, often referred to as the flyover states by those on the coasts, but is being transmitted through high voltage line that further burdens those middle states to bring energy to the coasts, namely California and New York. So why is that a problem? This slide shows the votes in our last presidential election. About the only thing that mainstream and conservative media agree on is that Republican support is represented by the color red and Democratic support is represented by the color blue. So the darkest red states are those won convincingly by Trump, and the darkest blue states are those won convincingly by Biden. If you compare this map to the one in the Princeton report, you can see that the blue states are the takers in this equation, and the red states are the givers. Given the current polarization in our politics, and the fact that the energy evolution will further drive down the economies of those red states, we simply don't see how a plan for deep electrification that puts all the burden on the red states for the benefit of the blue states has a snowball's chance in hell of being adopted within a time frame to allow the evolution to occur by 2050. The final issue we see with such a heavy reliance on deep electrification is the need for such a vast build-out of high-voltage transmission lines, estimated to be 5.3 times the current system in the U.S. We'll just use 2 pictures to summarize this risk. One is a picture of Puerto Rico's transmission system following a hurricane, and the other is of the second largest wildfire in California history that was blamed on sparks from high-voltage lines during windy and dry conditions. Climate change is supposed to increase both the frequency and severity of both conditions, so one has to question the concept of putting all of your energy eggs in one basket. Is this what led the IEA to not recommend such a solution? Oh yeah, we don't know because they didn't show their work, but we suspect it might be. If the 5 paths set forth in the Princeton study is not the path forward, how can the U.S. go forward and still achieve a goal of net zero by 2050? We think the result will look more like the IEA's path because we agree it is the most technically feasible, cost-effective, and socially acceptable. But to follow that path, we need to borrow strategies from our friends in New Zealand and Europe. And that means immediate and continuous action in 3 main areas: regulation of the storage and transport of hydrogen, coordination among industry participants, and advocacy with the public and government at all levels. Here in the U.S., we have a federal system where some things are controlled by the states and other things are controlled by the national government. Natural gas pipelines that cross state boundaries and the storage fields connected to those pipelines are regulated at the national level by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which controls both the siting of the facilities and also the commercial terms under which they provide service. However, that is not the case for hydrogen. If we are to reap the benefits of repurposing natural gas pipelines and storage fields for hydrogen use, the current system would require the pipeline and storage field to obtain permission from FERC to discontinue natural gas service, and then obtain authority from every state in which it operates to provide hydrogen service. In our view, that will likely need to change to limit the power of states to block needed conversions. On this map, we show the number of storage fields near high voltage lines that could be used to store green hydrogen. In addition, most pipelines are operated on land that the pipeline does not own outright, but merely has an easement from the owner. The pipelines will likely need to renegotiate all of those easements to successfully convert a pipeline. If the pipeline had the federal government's power to condemn property like natural gas pipelines currently do, that process could be accelerated to allow for conversions to occur in a timely manner. Because both of those processes could take years to achieve, the industry needs to start working on both aspects straight away, as the plan in New Zealand recognizes. Unlike in New Zealand, where the entire transmission system is owned by a single company, ownership of the U.S. pipeline system is very fragmented. If you add on top of that the various companies involved in the hydrogen supply chain, the fragmentation grows exponentially. So the second hurdle we envision here is coordination among all of the industry participants up and down the hydrogen supply chain. Here, the European example of cooperation is one that may need to be followed. There are two key areas where cooperation may be essential. First, the European plan calls for the creation of a hydrogen refueling network to support the adoption of hydrogen as a heavy truck fuel. The recommendation there is for hydrogen refueling stops every 150 kilometers, which is about every 90 miles. For all interstate highways in the U.S., that would require over 500 hydrogen refueling stations to be built. The map on this slide shows just the highways that are most traveled by heavy trucks. By overlaying that highway map with the interstate pipeline system, we find there is plenty of intersection between the two. Similarly, while the Princeton report did not rely heavily on hydrogen, it did suggest that there were 4 areas where hydrogen hubs, principally for end-use purposes, make sense: the Texas-Louisiana Gulf Coast and the 3 hubs depicted on this slide. Again, if we overlay maps of the interstate natural gas system with the 4 areas mentioned, we see there are existing natural gas pipelines that could connect some of these areas together and create a much larger hydrogen supply system for the U.S. Coordination is probably required here to quickly agree on the highway routes and the hub locations so that a backbone similar to that in the European plan can be developed here in the U.S. The final hurdle is advocacy before the public and at all levels of government. This type of advocacy has often been hampered here in the U.S. as companies jockey for competitive advantage. But we think it is essential if hydrogen is to have a viable future. Even though our federal government may not be as functional as New Zealand's, the current environment is probably the best time for hydrogen to make its case at the federal level. In August, a bipartisan group of U.S. senators and the President agreed on an infrastructure bill that has some key support for hydrogen to play a role in the energy evolution here. On this slide, we have highlighted in peach a number of those that relate to hydrogen or carbon capture and storage. The single largest amount of money dedicated to hydrogen was $8 billion for development of 4 regional hydrogen hubs. While the Princeton study did not provide a ringing endorsement for hydrogen, the fact that it suggested that there were 4 key areas for hydrogen use may provide a convenient source of support for going with those as the hubs to seek this funding. But there needs to be more than just coordination. There needs to be action. Action taken to show that hydrogen can be part of the solution. So what is our bottom line? We cannot emphasize enough that the time to act is now. All 3 hurdles we have highlighted require immediate attention and immediate action. If that is done, we can see a win-win-win situation where current asset owners are involved, hydrogen becomes more than the last piece of the puzzle, as suggested by the NRDC, and the U.S. achieves the goal of net zero by 2050 in a way that can unite the country rather than further polarize it.